Against the backdrop of climate change and millions of hectares of degraded land spreading across the globe, a strange story has quietly unfolded in northwestern Costa Rica. In the mid-1990s, more than 1,000 truckloads of orange peels were dumped onto a patch of dead land, bringing with them foul odors, swarms of flies, fierce public backlash, and even a high-profile lawsuit. The experiment quickly faded into obscurity, remembered as yet another embarrassing failure in the history of environmental conservation. But 16 years later, when scientists returned, what they saw stunned the entire field of ecology. So what really happened beneath those rotting layers of orange peels? And how could a dumping ground transform itself into a thriving forest? Today, join Terran Works as we explore the journey that turned an environmental disaster into one of the most astonishing ecological transformations ever recorded. But to understand what really happened, let's borrow H.G. Wells' imaginary time machine and travel back into the past. Costa Rica is a beautiful country with an almost absurd level of biodiversity. It occupies just 0.03% of the world's land area, yet contains nearly 6% of global biodiversity. Its people are immensely proud of its reputation as a green nation. And yet, even in this ecological paradise, some regions had been degraded to the point of being nearly beyond rescue. One of them lay in northwestern Costa Rica, inside the Guanacaste Conservation Area, or ACG, a biodiversity treasure that had been extensively converted into cattle pastureland over several decades. Unlike wild grazing animals, such as bison in North America or migrating antelope herds in Africa, cattle do not move. The consequences came quickly. Prolonged grazing stripped away ground vegetation, causing the soil to lose nutrients and leaving trees unable to regenerate. As the soil became exhausted, an invasive grass from Africa, Hyparrhenia rufa, or jaragua, rapidly took over the entire area, crowding out native species and becoming fuel for fires during the dry season. It was perhaps the only species that felt at home on land depleted by overgrazing. Under such conditions, forest restoration was nearly impossible, as even the hardiest plants could not take root across more than 40,000 hectares of severely degraded land, rendering traditional solutions ineffective. And then, just when everything seemed beyond saving, a miraculous orange juice factory appeared. It came from two names that had been closely tied to Costa Rica for decades: Daniel Jansen and Winnie Hallwachs. As leading ecologists with long-standing ties to the University of Pennsylvania, Jansen and Hallwachs did not study tropical forests solely from laboratories. They lived with them, worked alongside them, and personally witnessed each hectare of the ACG degrade over time. Because of this, they understood clearly that if the ACG were ever to be restored, it would require an approach far removed from traditional methods: bolder, cheaper, and most importantly, capable of operating at scale.
Suddenly, we're realizing that by pushing it away and getting rid of it, we're damaging ourselves very badly.
The opportunity did not come from a research lab, but from a factory. Just a short distance from the conservation area, in the mid-1990s, an orange juice company called Del Oro S.A. began operations. Every day, the pressing of thousands of oranges produced enormous quantities of peel and pulp waste, forcing the company to find a solution for disposal. By coincidence, Del Oro owned a tract of land located directly adjacent to the national park, with no plans for cultivation. So why not turn it into a dumping site for orange peels? Immediately, Jansen saw what no one else did. This was not waste. This was a golden key for a dying forest. In 1997, Jansen and Hallwachs brokered an agreement. Under its terms, Del Oro was allowed to dump orange waste onto a 3-hectare plot inside the ACG, an area that was heavily degraded and nearly devoid of ecological value. In return, the national park would receive a massive amount of organic material entirely free of charge. The country gained land, and Del Oro gained free, regulated waste disposal. But for the ACG, this was a bold ecological gamble. In the eyes of Johnson and Hallwachs, the solution was both logical and elegant. No chemical fertilizers, no tens of thousands of expensive saplings, just making use of what society was rushing to discard and then letting nature do the rest. And with that, one of the most controversial ecological experiments of the 20th century officially began. According to their reasoning, when spread over the soil, orange peels would not only smother invasive grasses and retain moisture, but also decompose into a massive source of nutrients capable of triggering a microbial boom, creating a continuous cycle of decomposition, humus formation, and moisture retention. But all of this still existed only as theory on paper. When put into practice, the scale of the idea was both bold and nearly insane. This was no longer an ordinary compost pile. It was an open-air ecological experiment betting on a much larger assumption that even the most severely damaged ecosystems still possess the ability to heal themselves if given the right initial conditions. The experiment officially began in 1997 and entered its operational phase within that same year. From then on, Del Oro started sending truckload after truckload of orange waste, mainly peels and pulp left after juicing, deep into the ACG conservation area. Within just 1 year, roughly 12,000 tons of organic waste were dumped onto a 3-hectare plot of land that had been nearly exhausted. To anyone not given prior explanation, the scene looked no different from an industrial dumping ground in the middle of a national park. And for many Americans, that sense of disgust may not be unfamiliar. In a country where more than half of organic waste is still treated as a mess to be buried and turned into methane underground. There were no warning signs, no protective fences. The pungent smell of oranges drifted on the wind. Flies appeared in dense swarms. Insects and fungi began invading almost immediately. Yet at that time, the research team held firmly to the belief that the initial chaos was merely a necessary transitional phase, an unavoidable first step before nature began to do the rest of the work. And reality struck far more violently than expected. When the final trucks pulled away, what remained was not hope, but widespread skepticism. Simply put, people were unhappy with how the orange dumping site was being run. But the strongest opposition came from a rather unexpected place. Del Oro's biggest competitor, the fruit juice company Tico Fruit. They filed a lawsuit accusing Del Oro of contaminating a protected ecosystem and violating national regulations. According to Tico Fruit's legal arguments, orange waste could release citric acid and oils such as D-limonene, which they labeled as carcinogenic, while also creating conditions for dangerous pests like the Mediterranean fruit fly to spread. But behind these environmental warnings lay an issue of competition. Del Oro benefited from a free waste disposal solution and the public image of contributing to the park, while Tico Fruit did not. Tensions escalated, the media stepped in, and environmental agencies were quickly pressured to intervene. From an environmental initiative, it turned into a battle between the region's 2 largest fruit juice corporations. By 1998, less than a year after the first trucks rolled in, the bold ecological experiment was forced to stop. Everything ended abruptly, leaving behind 3 hectares of land covered in partially decomposing organic waste. In the public eye, the project was quickly framed as an embarrassing failure. A reckless idea, poorly controlled, and unsuccessful. No one returned to take measurements. Even the project's initiators were forced to leave, carrying with them unanswered questions. And then, for more than a decade afterward, that patch of land nearly vanished from all scientific maps. But unknown to anyone in that long silence, a quiet yet relentless process was unfolding under sun, rain, and time. Everything seemed to have come to an end. Until 2013, when a small detail was accidentally brought back into focus. While researching tropical forest restoration, Timothy Troyer, then a Princeton graduate student, found an old paper by Jansen and Hallwachs noting that no one had returned to the site since the experiment ended. That decade-long gap sparked his curiosity, leading him to contact the two ecologists and make a simple but risky decision to go back and find the site. But the search was anything but easy. The original markers had vanished. Old maps no longer matched the terrain. The landscape had changed so drastically that land once known as dry pasture was now nearly unrecognizable. It took considerable time, following memories, documents, and educated guesses before they finally identified the location they were looking for. And when they stood before it, everyone fell silent. They were completely unprepared for what they were about to see. The land was not merely green again, it had been utterly transformed, with trees rising tall, vines wrapping tightly, dense vegetation spreading throughout, and insects and birds returning across the forest canopy. Before them was no longer an abandoned experimental site, but a living, complete ecosystem, as if it had never been destroyed. Not stopping at the initial astonishment, Troyer decided to turn this discovery into a formal scientific study. In 2017, Troyer and his colleagues published their findings, showing that above-ground biomass in the Orange Peel site had increased by as much as 176% compared to the control area, nearly 3 times higher. Even more striking, this entire process occurred without irrigation, without additional planting, and without any maintenance activities for more than 16 years. The numbers were impressive, but wait, it gets even stranger. The invasive African grass had completely disappeared, smothered by the orange peels, clearing the way for native trees to return. No one knows for certain why this happened. It remains a million-dollar question. One hypothesis suggests that the massive volume of orange peels not only added nutrients and eliminated the invasive grass layer that suppressed forest regeneration, but also triggered an explosion of soil microorganisms. The thick organic mass created a carbon and nitrogen-rich environment, retained moisture effectively, and stabilized temperature, thereby accelerating decomposition and allowing native seeds to germinate more easily. Because no one monitored the site for 16 years, the exact mechanism behind this recovery may never be fully understood. But science does not stop at recording a miracle. It must explain whether that miracle can be replicated elsewhere. The answer is maybe, but not certainly. The success in Costa Rica depended on a range of specific conditions, such as a tropical climate, degraded but non-toxic soil, the continued presence of native seed sources, and the fact that the orange peels were dumped in a single event rather than continuously. Applied in the wrong context, organic material could make soil too acidic, promote pests, or disrupt microbial balance. In fact, Costa Rica is not the only place to have inadvertently touched upon this principle. In the United States and Canada, compost made from thousands of animal carcasses has been used to restore agricultural soils and revive grasslands after drought in as little as 9 days. The mechanism itself is quite simple. When a sufficiently large mass of organic material is gathered, microorganisms begin to get to work, breaking down tissue, generating heat, and naturally neutralizing pathogens. However, just like the orange peel experiment in Costa Rica, this method is far from unconditional. If poorly managed, leachate and emissions from the composting process can become sources of pathogen spread and pose serious risks to the surrounding environment. Even so, the story from Costa Rica leaves behind a difficult question to ignore. If organic waste can quietly create a forest, then how many other resources are we wasting every day, simply because we have never looked at them in a different way?
And then, how do we save its biodiversity? And the save it part is what I just referred to as getting humanity to be willing to leave it in the room, allowing it to be at the negotiating table. Okay? That's the real challenge, in my opinion.
Sometimes what nature needs most is not intervention, but a chance to begin again.